The Alldus podcast is brought to you by Alldus International, supplying your expert AI and digital transformation staffing needs across the US and Europe. Today, you are listening to our ServiceNow series, where we interview the best and brightest of the industry to share their story, advice, and views on the exciting world of ServiceNow and digital transformation.
Welcome to the Alldus podcast. I'm your host, Ben Sparks, and today we are continuing with our digital transformation series with a focus on ServiceNow. We are very pleased to host Jeff today. Jeff has built and led large-scale 250-person plus global multifunctional teams, delivering world-class product infrastructure and services across multiple industries for both internal and external customers. Jeff currently holds the position of IT Delivery Vice President at Fleetcor, and he has held positions in the past of Delivery Head for PMO, Director of ServiceNow Transformation Office at Verizon, where he held a very casual 21 years tenure. In this conversation, Jeff's going to talk to me about some of the macro trends driving digital transformation in the telco sector. He's going to talk a little bit about advice on transformational change and some of the advice that he would give or has given to C-suite. Why ServiceNow is the platform of choice for enterprise customers. And he's then going to touch on some important lessons he's learned on the way on stakeholder management and also building and maintaining willing teams. So, Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's good to be here.
So we mentioned before Verizon, and you were there 21 years, but you're no longer there. You're at Fleetcor. So
that's right.
Those who haven't heard of the organization, do you mind giving us a quick highlight of who they are as a business?
Sure. So Fleetcor is a super fast growing FinTech company based here in Atlanta, but we're a global business. Started life out doing fuel cards for truckers way back when. And then that led to lodging cards. And then it really exploded into anything that you could do that was a prepaid card. From there, we've transitioned into much more of a straight play business to business, B2B, FinTech, payments processing company. Properties in Russia, rest of Europe, Brazil, North America, including Canada. And so it's a pretty fast moving company. We have a strategy of acquisition as well. We buy other companies and transform them into our platforms and gain some economies of scale. So it's been great.
Awesome. And I remember from our previous chats, you're no stranger to mergers and acquisitions. I'm sure we'll
come
on to that in a bit. And your current role, so you're currently in a position of a vice president level. Tell our listeners a little bit more about your role and responsibilities.
Sure. So two main roles. Kind of my day job is to help bring in projects from the business. So business has a new project, or we acquire a new company and they need to standardize, or we want to take an app to the cloud. And so how do we bring those in? So all the processes around how do we bring those applications into the fold, prioritize them, and then turn them around very quickly. And we particularly have worked in recent months on the speed of doing a build of a server, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, Windows or Linux, and how do we automate that as much as we can, primarily with Ansible. But automation often comes after you've done a fair amount of documentation and standardization. And so that's really the kind of the process we've been working on, is how do we take the little next piece and put it into either another Ansible script or put it into the master Ansible script. And our goal really is from approved request in ServiceNow to get to preview our subject, that once that gets approved, everything else to build that, either that EC2 in AWS or to build a server on-prem, is pretty much automated. And so that's the kind of stuff that we're working on. And then the other part of my role is I have a portfolio of applications that are the monitoring applications and then MuleSoft, as well as Sterling File Gateway. So that's my part-time job, I guess.
Sounds very part-time. And I love that you have a very holistic role across the business. And so I'd love to zoom out a little bit, and we'll come on to ServiceNow and some of the platform pieces in a moment. But you've obviously had great tenure at Verizon. You've then obviously been at HP, and you're now in the FinTech world. we can probably hone in on telco, but if you don't mind touching on fintech as well, I'd love to know some of the more macro trends you're seeing in those industries, and why are we seeing so much happen in the digital transformation space? And I think you really generally here at a macro level.
Sure. I think I'll talk a little bit about the company I was at before Verizon, eventually merged with Verizon. That company was called Alltel. That's where I started out pretty much my career. And we had a growth through acquisition strategy. And so when I started, we were the 28th largest wireless provider. And when we merged with Verizon, we were the 5th largest. We were actually the largest footprint, so the largest geographic footprint. So we had properties all over the United States. And as we acquired these companies, part of my role was to go out and meet the IT talent that we were acquiring. And I don't know how many M&A you've done, but it seemed like they were like free resources. Somehow they were paid for by the deal for a period of time, a year or whatever. And we had other people on the team that were looking at, what hardware did we get? What apps do we get? How do we normalize bringing those in and standardizing? And do we sell? Do we get rid of? Do we keep in inventory any leftover hardware? I was trying to do that from a people standpoint. And so there was great folks that we were in these companies we acquired. And so we were trying to bring them in, find out where they would line up. This was primarily infrastructure. So database, Unix, some middleware. And we ended up, an adjunct to that, or a unintended consequence, I guess, is from having one centralized team in Alpharetta, Georgia. So now we had 6 or 7 teams as far away as Twinsburg, Ohio, Bellevue, Washington. We had folks in Little Rock, people elsewhere in Pennsylvania. So this was late 90s, early 2000s, and we had to go through this transformation that I think a lot of people went through last year with COVID. And it was really on how do you effectively manage a team that is geographically dispersed. And so our response to that was very ITEL specific. We bought in to an ITEL approach of how do we bring in work, prioritize it, assign it. We got really good at assigning work without supervisors touching every element of work, but to be able to flow work into the ticketing system, whether that's a request or a defect or even a change, and to be able to digitally move that work around to this team that now is geographically dispersed. And so I think, to answer your question, I think much of corporate America has had to do that in the last year because of COVID. The whole workforce became remote. And I think that we'll see, for a generation, we'll see that reverberate down of companies that have figured out how to be super world-class teams in a remote situation. I think have an advantage moving forward.
And I presume this is really uncharted territory because what was that, 2016?
But no, this is like 2002, 2004.
Wow.
We were the only groups that were using instant messaging. We were doing video calls. It was a set of tools, right? So the ticketing system and the technologies that we mentioned, but then it was also process. We decided to assign work based on timestamp, not so much on capability. So everybody on a team ought to be able to work every ticket that comes in. But I think the most important part, and probably the closest thing to a passion of mine, and we talked about my other podcasts, is culture. I think it was the culture of how do we always be, this is a little tired phrase now, but failing forward fast. We really bought into that, and we're going to try this. If it doesn't work, you know what? In 60 days, we'll try something different. But we're going to keep trying things to harness the power of this team that was geographically dispersed, and it became very cultural of how do we do that. And
nice. So obviously we hear a lot about ServiceNow as a platform. A lot of people are saying it's the platform of choice for enterprise. Looking back to that time when you brought ServiceNow into the business, what was the value that you saw back then? And if you look back on that time,
so back then, I don't even think ServiceNow had been invented. We used another product. I brought ServiceNow, or helped bring ServiceNow into Verizon. This would have been like 2014, maybe 15. And so Verizon is a great case study for why do we need ServiceNow. Verizon was really a collection of 3 pretty powerful companies. You had AirTouch, Bell Atlantic, and GTE merged to form Verizon in 2000. And so those companies run deep. They had been doing things Bell Atlantic goes back to AT&T, right? So for 50 years, 80 years, as long as there was a telecom, these companies had been doing things. And so our CIO had a vision to dramatically improve the digital workspace for the employee experience at Verizon. And we were going through a time where we needed to compete with companies like Facebook and Google in the advertisement space. And we needed to break free from where we were in the dodgy old telecom and become a little bit more customer forward and technology forward. And so one of the initiatives was to digitize the workspace, and ServiceNow became a key platform to that for Verizon.
And looking at it now, current day in Fleetcor?
Yep. So I came to Fleetcor. It's funny because Verizon, it was like, roll up your sleeves and let's roll it out. We had hard conversations. Wow, what is an incident? What's a problem? What's change? What's critical? When are we going to escalate? Whatever. All those things were greenfield, trying to figure out. At Fleetcor, ServiceNow is pretty well entrenched and installed. They had a great business partner that helped them set some of this up. What we're trying to do with it now, and it's nice because it's everybody in the company is used to it. We do our time tracking out of ServiceNow across the board, out of IT into the business. Everybody has to log in to ServiceNow, and so everybody's familiar with the interface. And so so some of the things that we're trying to do right now, I talked a little bit about the acceleration of the automation of a build. So the other piece is how do we make the incoming work into ServiceNow more effective? And so we have recently been using the project management portfolio function or module, and then tying that into the build process is like the little key link that we're trying to accomplish in the right way, so that we can account for everybody that has a need. It always becomes an IT need. What the project management function is going to do for us is to help us validate those needs against a larger risk portfolio or an ROI portfolio of, well, what is the true priority of the business? And it can't just be because this person is loud or boisterous or knows somebody. It's got to come through a more regimented way to make sure that we are applying priority to the right tools and processes and projects that the company needs.
And obviously, as the platform's becoming more, as it's evolving, and obviously we're seeing things like AI, etc. Where would you see the platform growing to in Fleetcor currently, or if you, any other company?
Sure. I think self-service is a big piece of that. The cloud certainly makes things more conducive to tear up, tear down, build up, tear down applications and services as needed. The traditional IT sense, there used to be a lot of gatekeepers. There was the person that owned the data center. I remember trying to get servers installed for like critical projects, and like their change windows where we only do changes 60 days out. And of course, they had all these war stories of you put in one more network switch and it took the whole data center down or whatever. And then there was gatekeepers around servers and building databases. But it's like the more and more of all that gets automated and more of all that gets put to the cloud, an unintended or another consequence of that is you remove some of those gatekeepers. And so now if I go to the whiteboard and I build out this process of, okay, here business has a need for a cloud-based service or application, what are the gatekeepers from once we say yes, go, we approve that financially, to when that thing is actually up and running? And there's not a lot. There may be a change control in its future, but maybe not. And so if I can streamline the process so that I can now deploy applications at a rate that matches the speed of business, that's something that IT has never been able to do, is to match the transformational nature of business. And I think the folks that have been around a while know that IT gets a bad rap of, oh, you're always slow, it costs a lot of money, don't deliver, you got all sorts of problems. I think through automation, and I think ServiceNow is a key piece of that, and the cloud, those things are much more attainable than they've been probably in the past. That's my view, at least.
Nice. You've obviously touched on a couple of the large projects that you've been involved with. If you had to hang your hat on one, what would be some of the, or maybe it's not one, maybe there's a couple, but what would be some of the most notable kind of career projects that you still look back on and go, that's the one.
I'll probably talk about a project I did at Verizon. So I was in the infrastructure side at Alltel. Then we got bought. You're going to find your way when you get bought. Your old job is gone. And so I networked pretty hard, found a job on the software development side. And partly, and this is my view, partly because I didn't have a whole team reporting to me at this moment, I got this huge project, the CIO, kind of the CIO's pet project, which was in the wireless division, was to move the rating function off the mainframe onto commodity hardware and to move it from a batch nightly event to a near real-time event. And so those things were very critical to Verizon as a company as they were launching 4G LTE, where consumers could use up all of their data in an instant, where that had never been the case. And the systems that were in place to handle voice and even text, where you couldn't consume enough voice in an hour to get some huge bill, but you could data. And so I and another business analyst started this team. We eventually grew it to about 250 people worldwide. We developed 2 products, deployed them to production. The first one was a data mediation platform that handled all the incoming traffic that came out of the network, so the switches and towers, and processed those. That's about 7 billion transactions a day. And then on top of that, we built a rating engine that then married that data with the customer records and rated each call, so each data, each text, each voice, and then each picture. So that was a really big project. I switched CIOs in the middle of it, which was weird. I met the new CIO. Hey, my name's Jeff, and I'm spending like 80% of your discretionary budget. There's not a whole lot you can do about it because we're 2 years into this 5-year project. And to his credit, he stuck with it. I'm not sure he wanted that project on his own. But eventually, we got both products into production. It was a very interesting journey, building a team at 15, 20 people. That's going to be 50, 60 people. That's going to become 100 people and then 200 people worldwide. Those are big time growing pains. And then the other transformation thing that was happening, just as transformational, was moving from waterfall to agile. Verizon itself was a big waterfall shop. We had to do agile because we were pushing out so much code. We were pushing code to production almost every night, but certainly every week. We were making bug fixes and changes and functionality. And then the last thing that was transformational was really going from a project approach to things, like we have these deadlines, we've got to get this done by this date or whatever, to being a product team. Well, now we have 2 products that are in production, and really we have to care and feed for those products, and they're in production, and 100% of Verizon Wireless's revenue went through this product. And so it was very critical that things got buttoned down from a production standpoint that, maybe just 6 months earlier in the process weren't quite as critical because it felt more like a project, like a development effort. But then once you're in production, it's a whole different thing. So that was a big thing. It saves about $100 million a year in offset MIPS cost. And so it did the trick. So that was a pretty big project.
And as you may reminisce now and look back on these, what have been some of the key learns or some of the more difficult things you had to navigate that really forged your career moving forward?
Sure. The first thing is never sign up for a project that has 5 years until the ROI. That's my first advice. And then number 2 is probably have some discussion about, is the CIO going to be there long enough to see it through? Or is it whoever the champion is? So those are things that were unforeseeable at the time, but those are probably the rockiest days of that project, where when we transitioned from one CIO to another. And really, overall, and even I remember with the new CIO, I had to go back and show him projections from years past. We were only off a 5-year project. We were only off 1 quarter, and we probably could have gone live even on the quarter we had predicted, but it was end of year, and Verizon at the end of the day is actually a retail company. Most of their new sales are the Christmas season. So wisely, he said, no, let's do it first quarter. So really, we weren't all that late, probably better than most IT projects. I think IT projects have like an 80% failure rate as far as hitting the date they originally wanted to. But it was very long. It was too long. 5 years is too long. So that's my advice. Chunk it up. Try to do, 5 one-year projects and be a little bit more able to navigate around that.
You are listening to the Alldus Podcast. When you're looking to scale your team, or if you are interested in showcasing your company in a future episode, reach out today. Or if you're in the market for a new role, visit our website to view open positions, www.alldus.com.
As IT and the business become more and more integrated, we do hear all the time that managing internal executive stakeholders is a thing that a lot of people have front of mind. I know we probably, didn't necessarily look at this question initially, but what would be some of your tips and tricks for managing executive level stakeholders?
Yeah, sure. I think the other lesson learned is if you had to ask us, what was the requirement for that project? At some level, I described it, move off the mainframe, whatever. But really, the requirements were make it function like the legacy. I think that's a mistake too. What we uncovered there was the legacy had been built over 40 years, 30 years. It was very old code, and there was a lot of things done there that were very tricky. Like, for instance, if there was an error, even if it's a fraction of a penny, if there was an error in the legacy, do you carry that error to the new system? If you don't, then how do you admit that the error was there all along and you potentially been overbilling or underbilling customers? And I remember having to meet with legal folks and rewriting some of the little legalese that you click on. If you've ever read those, I was involved with rewriting a push of that to cover for this. Hey, we've rewritten our software. We have fixed some errors. This doesn't mean that you're going to get any money back or that you owe us any more money from the past. The question really on the table is, how do you manage internal stakeholders? And I think getting to an agreed upon set of requirements is, maybe it's not perfect, but maybe it's one way to help clarify, because when things got tough, as they do in all projects, there were some important stakeholders that weren't necessarily tied to the success of this project. In fact, some of their success and career was tied to the legacy system being successful. And it would have been helpful, I think, maybe to have a agreed upon, reasonably detailed set of requirements that all the stakeholders have inked their name on, so that to almost be used as a guidepost for when things get tough, we can look back and say, oh, here, this is the requirement. This is our guidestone of what we should do in the next situation when we uncover this next set of issues or whatever.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And if you were to be a coach, and I'm thinking of a C-suite executive who's about to embark on transformational change, and he's going to sit here and say, Jeff, you've done this a number of times. What should I do? And this doesn't necessarily need to be someone at enterprise level, right? This could be someone in the sort of medium business world as well. What would be some of your advice that they need to do to make sure it's a successful transformation? And then that sort of probably includes adoption of the new technology as well.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good question. I have that opportunity a fair amount. I've had opportunities to move in and out of different companies. Even when I was at Verizon/Alltel forever, I don't think I ever had the same job more than a few years in a row. I think that there is a axiom that is, it's really easy to be optimistic in the view coming up. And one of the things I think I've tried to become pretty good at is, you don't want to be pessimist, right? Because nobody likes pessimists. Oh, we can't do that. Try that before. But I think I read something recently, which was people that are higher impact employees tend to think a little bit more negatively of themselves and their abilities than those that are not quite as proficient seem to think more highly of themselves. And the result of that is people that are maybe a little less effective tend to have more optimistic schedules, and it invariably they then miss it. And then what I've seen is then it becomes a habit. It's every week I'm just going to move that deliverable out a week, and I lose any kind of accountability. And I would much rather see leaders try to hold team members accountable to a date. And you know what? We're going to spend way more time trying to come up with this date, or how do we get to that date, or how do we get to a date for date? What information do we need to commit to a date? And then once we commit to it, the team's going to commit to it. I as a leader, or I as the coach, or all the team, we're all going to commit. And this is when we're going to work overtime, or we're going to come in on the weekend, because we've committed to a date. We all had all the information that we needed to commit to a date, and then something happened, and we need to pull some extra hours to deliver it. But I would much rather us spend a little bit of more time on the front end with eyes wide open. We need to do 50,000 lines of code, and we know that's going to generate so many defects, and so it's going to take so many hours to fix those defects. So I'm going to build all that into a schedule. So when someone says, hey, when is this thing going to be in production? I'm going to have a calculation. I'm not just going to say, oh, it's 3 weeks of coding and we're going to be done, because that's the very tip of the iceberg of really standing up a product in production.
And on the other side, if you were coaching sort of one of your team, what would be some of the advice that you'd give them to ensure that they're the people at the ground level who are maybe on the front lines of an implementation? Yeah,
that's a great question too. I think it's very similar. It's the idea of empowerment and accountability. And what I often see, just you can easily see people haphazardly making a date and not feeling really committed to it. I see many people say, I can't make this other group do it. I'm not really responsible. And so I'm waiting on other people. And so I can't do my thing because I'm not, able to. And I've taught kind of culture class throughout my career. And one of the things a mentor of mine told me, he did the same kind of culture class, and he would talk about empowerment. And so he'd be speaking to a room of, 20, 30 people. He said, hey, everybody here, think about the last time, or within the last 6 months, have you been, he usually called to the carpet or called in by your boss and said, hey, you exceeded your authority. Who can share a story in the last 6 months of when they exceeded their authority? And the room goes quiet and nobody has an example. All the hands go down. And his point is this: how can you say you don't have the authority to accomplish great things if you've never really pushed the limits? And quickly you follow, well, you're not asking anybody to do anything illegal or unethical, but really power is something that is exercised. And it's very difficult if you go to your boss and said, hey, do you think it's okay if I escalate to this VP or to the CIO? They may say no. They may say yes. But in the moment, in the moment of conflict that you need to take something to that next level, maybe you just need to do it and then see where the chips fall afterwards. And I think that if you can imagine everybody pushing their limits a little bit more, not trying to instill chaos, but to eradicate that kind of passiveness of, oh, I can't do anything about it. It's not my deal. It's my department or whatever. But you know what? I'm going to take it. I'm going to go to that boss and I'm going to see if I can get this done, or I'm going to escalate that, or I'm going to try to get it done today and not done tomorrow. So the whole team could be much more effective if everybody would just push it a little bit. And then the moral of the story is, hey, if we come back here in a year, we want everybody to have a story where they pushed the limits just a little bit and their boss had to rein them back in. So that would be my 2 cents there.
Love it. So I was going to say to you, what are some of the pivotal moments that have defined you as a leader? But maybe I should ask you, what are the most pivotal points where you've pushed the limits that have defined you as a leader? But I'd love to know. And I'm thinking, looking back here, and the reason I'm asking is that there are a lot of people on the same journey, right? Everyone wants to, or not everyone, but there's a lot of people growing to be leaders and be the best leader they can. And I'd love you to share a bit of your experience in getting there.
I'll tell one from Alltel. This is so we had a billing system that was down for about 2 weeks. This was our production billing system, Teleco, and the world was ending. It was terrible. And so I owned the vendor relationship with Hewlett Packard and Sybase and EMC. And I was trying to escalate this particular issue in all three of those companies and trying to get to the right level to get immediate expert level. Beyond all the support people, we had these weird data pointers that were not working within a Sybase database. And so I was escalating. We were in 24/7 thing, and my boss had moved on to another situation. And so I was going to escalate until I got the right attention. And so I talked to all these cool titles that you would want. This was at Sybase. So I talked to, head of North American support, global vice president of support, global IT director, whatever, right? Everybody's got these cool titles. And I would just say, look, I need to talk to somebody that can do this. I need to hear back in an hour. If I don't hear from you, I need to talk to your boss. And so up the ladder we would go. And eventually we got to the CEO. CEO is John Chin. And so I called, of course, you get closer and closer, you talk to admins and whatever. So I was talking to the administrative assistant, and I kind of had my same spiel of, hey, I need to talk to Mr. Chin. And he's on a plane. I'm like, when is he going to land? I need to talk to him right away. This is critical. And she said, look, I'm going to get your message to him, but you don't need to be a jerk about it. I was like, right. Yes, ma'am. So, I think the point was that was about as hard as I could have pushed it. And so she did get in touch with him. He called me, he made it right, and it was pretty good. So it was interesting.
You mentioned before, and I think I've got these numbers right, you mentioned you grew teams from 2 to 15 to 250.
Yeah.
Advice to someone else doing that? That's a big feat. And I'm also thinking, look, it's one thing to build it. What do you do to sustain and continue it being a winning team?
Yep. Those are good questions. So pretty early on, I don't think at 15, but at like 20, we had ideas of how large this thing was going to be. We knew we had to build 2 products. We knew we had to dramatically accelerate delivery to where we needed to have parallel development teams. We needed to figure out how to break the legacy app into smaller little pods, and then each of those pods are going to become kind of their own flight path or whatever. And so we spent maybe a couple days over a few weeks to map out. This is our target, so we were 20, 25 people, but this is what it's going to look like. I don't think we ever built one that was 250 people, but this is what it's going to look like at full staff, which I think we predicted at, 150. And so we knew we had, what the advantage of having that target org is when we would go to hire somebody, even if it was I'm going to hire you to be a developer or a QA tester or whatever, we know that we really needed you to be development pod lead in about a year, for a year and a half. So I need you to code for a year and a half, and then I really need you to be like a super code reviewer, or I need you to be a QA tester and write test cases, but then in a year from now, I really need you to oversee the automation of test cases. And so it changed the profile of who we wanted to hire even pretty early on. And then it had this like framework, and then it was much easier. Wow, now we just need to go hire 5 QA testers, or, now we just need to hire some Scrum Masters, because we have this structure already of the one Scrum Master we hired early on that we know was going to become the lead and help us forge that center of excellence or whatever. And I think had we not done that, things would have been tougher and tougher, because it would have been harder to add leadership into the mix. We did some, obviously, but it would have been harder to add all the leadership and all the different layers once we already had teams there. So I think that played out pretty well, as much as it could have. Yeah.
That's really interesting, because and especially how granular you looked at what are the next 2 steps of that person's trajectory here as well. I think most people say, we think he might need to be a leader later. You've actually probably thought about that in a little bit more depth in the role, which is really impressive. But look, just before we close, that we touched on how the platform's evolving earlier. What extra value do you think companies are going to see from, let's say, ServiceNow or platforms such as ServiceNow in the next 5 years? If you had to get your crystal ball out and look to the future.
Yep. Well, we didn't really touch much on AI and machine learning and robotic process automation, but all that's coming. All that's here in a lot of ways. We didn't talk too much about my role at HPE, but my role at HPE was working with a team that was dramatically different. That they had been doing the same kinds of things for 10 or 15 years. We were servicing the Department of Defense. And so it was a different strategy that I had to employ, which was to really break down everything that we were doing as a team and start to build up how can we do some bits of automation here and there. So I really think that type of automation in the almost clerical sense of, if you looked at 1,000 tickets that came into, say, the Windows group, my guess is a good AI tool would be able to start helping to solve 80% of them. And so I think that's something that IT shops need to become experimental. And we're trying to do this a little bit at Fleetcor on the edges with some of our monitoring tools. And so some of those tools that feed into ServiceNow, we're trying to employ a little bit of AI before I even get to opening a ticket, right? So a classic example would be like space. I have a file system that's going to run out of space, and maybe I can get the tool itself to zip up files, tar files, move things out, grow the file system. There's all sorts of things that we can get the tools to do rather than to wake up a human to add space to file system, whatever. I think that's a pretty classic example, but that's true on much of IT, right? Much of IT is redundant and preventative. And so preventative AI in those tool sets, I think, is exciting as well.
And I know I didn't give you this ahead of time, but it's something I've just thought of. What's your view on what companies should be doing to make sure that the foundations are in place to have productive AI?
One thing that I can see as being helpful from a foundational standpoint is how much work are teams doing in ServiceNow versus outside of ServiceNow. If, let's say, ServiceNow is our platform, if I'm able to call you and say, hey, I forgot my password, can you reset my password? And you're, oh yeah, Jeff, that's cool. Okay, now it's done. But that didn't really go through ServiceNow. And so when we sit down and try to automate or throw some AI at password resets, we've now confused it because we have lots of work happening outside of ServiceNow. And so this is like good ITEL business anyhow, is like, do the work in the ticket. All the work should be done in the ticket, all the notes. Step 1, assign the ticket to yourself. Step 2, produce copious notes. Step 3, solve the problem. Let's repeat step 2 and 3 until the problem solves. I think that is a foundational helpfulness to an AI tool in the future, which is could go back and read, because that's what the RPA tools do. They go read the last 10,000 transactions and they decide for themselves what is the best outcome.
Jeff, this has been great. Really appreciate you taking the time. It's been a really nice casual conversation, but very informative. Jeff, thank you very much, buddy.
Sure, thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Alldus Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and any Android podcast of choice. You can also head over to our website, www.alldus.com, to listen to more podcasts, view our open roles, and stay up to date with industry news. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more great episodes coming very soon.